And more broadly, I think about this as an issue for environmental justice. Invasive species, we have them because of globalization, right? It's because we have these fantastic ways now of moving people and goods around the world. And we know that a sort of a side effect of that is also moving non-native species, which can become invasive. So there are people who, the group of people who I think gain the most from globalization are the ones like us living in a place like Chicago, where we suffer the least from the problems of invasive species. The people who are not really involved in this whole globalized economy, at least in very many cases, they're people who are the most affected by invasive species.
My guest today is Dr. Ruben Keller, professor here at Loyola University. Ruben, it's great to have you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Let's start by talking about crayfish. It's one of the species you study. Mm-hmm. Why crayfish?
Well, I began to work on crayfish during my PhD, which I did at the University of Notre Dame. So I grew up in Australia. I came to the US for my PhD. And the lab that I was in, David Lodge's lab at Notre Dame, had been working on rusty crayfish, an invader, in northern Wisconsin. And he'd been working on them for decades. So it was a very natural thing for me to become interested in, to become involved in that work. So I worked on them somewhat during my graduate degree, and then it was years later that I got the job at Loyola, and I really wanted to set up a field system to start doing field work in the Chicago region. So crayfish was a natural place for me to look, because I already had some experience. And what I've discovered is that there are some really, really interesting things going on with crayfish in Lake Michigan, in the Chicago River, and then in smaller lakes and ponds around here. So I work primarily on invasive species, and we have these two invaders, the rusty and the red swamp crayfish, that are spreading and causing lots of impacts. And crayfish as a freshwater ecologist, crayfish are fundamentally sort of very interesting and impactful organisms. They're the largest invertebrates that live in freshwater ecosystems around here. They get to very high densities, and they're omnivorous. They will eat everything from detritus. They can survive eating dead leaves and sticks and things at the bottom of a lake or a river. And then they can eat living plants, aquatic plants, and all the way up they'll eat snails, and they'll certainly scavenge dead animals. So when you have a lot of organisms that are omnivorous running around on the bottom of a river or lake, then they have a very large impact, sort of an outsized impact.
And what would be the difference between the crayfish you'd find in Lake Michigan versus the river system?
This has been one of my favorite projects that I've done as a professor. It always feels like some amazing trick that I've pulled, that I get to go scuba diving in Lake Michigan, and that's part of my job, right? This is something that I would happily pay to do for recreation, but I get to do it for work. So out in Lake Michigan, by far the dominant crayfish species now is rusty crayfish. That's the invader. It moved into Lake Michigan, we think, around 2000, and it's been spreading ever since. So we've done quite a bit of work looking at how that has altered communities of crayfish in Lake Michigan. And what we've found is that pretty much as far south as we can go, we only find rusty crayfish. And we've been as far as the Illinois border, and we dive in water from about 20 feet to about 60 feet. Wherever there's habitat for crayfish, we find rusty crayfish, and only rusty crayfish. And it's that way until you get up just a little way north of Wilmette. And I don't really know what changes there, but you then transition into areas where you only find native crayfish. There are two species, the virile and the northern clearwater crayfish. So just north of Wilmette, it transitions from the invader to the natives. And my suspicion is that what's happening is that the rusty crayfish are continuing to move north, and as they go, they're extirpating, they're knocking out the native crayfish. So one of the things that I want to do in coming years is to go back and see how that has changed. What we see in lake crayfish is that they tend to be very, very numerous. The way that we catch them is you go out scuba diving and you look for rocks. So we find these areas, we use sonar on the boats. You find an area with relatively large size rocks, and this is the old glacial moraine that was left behind when the glaciers retreated. And you roll over the rocks, and then as quick as you can, you try and grab whatever comes out. So we find that crayfish out there get to really high densities. One of the things that's really interesting is those crayfish tend to be small. So the rusty crayfish that we find in the lake are substantially smaller than the rusty crayfish that we find in the Chicago River and in inland ponds. I don't know exactly why that is, but I suspect that it's because it's colder in the lake and their growing season, the season over which they can feed, is shorter, so they just tend to mature at a smaller size.
And is 60 feet the maximum depth you'd find a crayfish?
We've found them down to about 80 feet before. There are a couple of things that happen as you go deeper. One is that you can stay down for less time. We're scuba diving on air, and to be safe, we just can't stay down there for so long. But you also run out of moraine. The moraine, that rocky area in which we find them, tends to only go out to about 50 feet of depth. If you go beyond that, then you're onto sandy or just flat clay. And we don't find crayfish out there, presumably because they can be picked off by fish so easily.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever dove on Julian's Reef?
The trout reef further north, I have looked at it longingly. It is a little bit too deep. It's down, it tops out at around, I think 110 or 120 feet.
Yeah.
I've spoken to, I have a colleague up in Milwaukee who has put down an underwater drone onto that and told me that the currents are very strong. So he has advised against it. So I have looked longingly at the charts of Julian's Reef, because one of the things that we'd really like to know is whether the crayfish are eating the eggs of lake trout. And Julian's Reef is one of these places where the lake trout are spawning, they're actively spawning. I would love to get down there and have a look and see if there are crayfish on the reef as well.
But my understanding is that the reef will go up to roughly 60 feet then, only in 60 feet depth of water, down to over 100. Is that correct?
We might be talking about a different reef. The one that I think I'm talking about starts deeper than that.
It does?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 60 feet.
Yeah.
I'd be perfectly happy going on to.
But it's much deeper.
Yeah, that's my understanding, yeah. I hope I have that right. I hope I'm talking about the same
No,
reef.
I think it's just due east of Waukegan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're talking about the same reef.
Yeah.
And then what about, have you dove on Morgan Shoal?
Yes, Morgan Shoal is lovely. It's very shallow, so very easy diving and completely covered in rusty crayfish. We had one of the days that I remember that we dove Morgan Shoal, there were 5 or 6 of us out there. Because it's shallow, we were able to stay in for 45 or 50 minutes, and we each came back with 45 or 50 crayfish that we'd caught. So, and all rusty crayfish.
Mm-hmm. And where are rusty crayfish normally found? What is their normal range?
They're native to a fairly small area of western Ohio and eastern Indiana in the Ohio River Basin. You'll hear me say this repeatedly, all the species that I study, I think they're super interesting. Rusty crayfish as well. So in their native range, they're a fairly diminutive species. It's believed that somebody figured out that they were good for bait. Relatively easy to catch, perhaps to breed in captivity, and then to move around for bait. So we think that that's how they've been moved around. And for reasons that we don't really understand, they do amazingly well in 60, 70 feet of water in Lake Michigan. They do well in the streams in their native range, and they do well in the Chicago River and in small ponds. So they're a very, very ecologically flexible species.
And so do they outcompete the native species that would normally be found in Lake Michigan?
Yeah, so that work that I began talking about in northern Wisconsin, so that's actually, there's an area of northern Wisconsin in Vilas County where Notre Dame has a field station and the University of Wisconsin has a field station. So there's an area of these lakes that has been extremely heavily studied for decades and decades. And that's actually one of the few places where we've been able to, where, as a scientific community, we've seen the initial invasion of rusty crayfish, and then we've been able to track it over time. So what we see up there is that the rusty crayfish come in, they're bigger, tougher, more aggressive than the native crayfish. And they just outcompete the native crayfish for resources. And the native crayfish tend to disappear from these lakes. If the natives hang on, it tends to be in the least favorable crayfish habitat, so in very mucky, sort of swampy areas.
And can you talk a little bit about the hierarchies that rusty crayfish form in the wild?
Hierarchies.
Social hierarchy within, yes.
Within, we know very little about that. One of the real challenges to working on aquatic species, and particularly to working on crayfish, is that to know they're there. So we can't really observe them in the wild. They're a nocturnal species that lives underwater. We don't have the camera technology to film them, and during the day they hide somewhere. They're trying to not be eaten by a fish. We know very, very little about social structure of crayfish. One of the things that keeps me up at night and drives me nuts is I've been working for years in the North Shore Channel, and I think that I know all of these things about how crayfish populations in their work, but I have never seen a crayfish underwater, except in extremely shallow water, right? I've never actually observed crayfish doing crayfish things, because the only way that we know that they're there is we trap them. So by the time that we see them, we've already disturbed whatever was going on. So we do know from lab experiments some of the very basics. Big crayfish dominate over little crayfish. Males are more aggressive than females. I would love to know a lot more about social structures, but we just don't have the technologies to observe it.
And I was reading something about some chemical cues too that are communicated, winners and losers of fights. Have you read anything along these lines?
I don't know about that work, no.
Were you interested in invasive species when you were an undergraduate in Australia?
No. When I was, and I had I knew about them, and I was generally interested in ecology and aquatic systems. But no, from the time that I was 7, my parents told me this story. I don't remember it, but we were on a family camping trip and went for a guided ranger hike around some rock pools. We were down by the beach, and that was led by a ranger who was a marine biologist, and I thought it was great. And at the end of it, I announced to my parents that I was going to be a marine biologist. So through most of my undergraduate, that was still sort of my focus, and I was taking classes in marine biology. But then it was really one professor who I had a huge amount of admiration for. I got on with him really well, and he happened to be a freshwater ecologist. So at the end of my sort of regular undergrad, I decided that I was going to go on and do a year of research with him. And we talked about projects, and the one that appealed to me the most was working on an invasive fish, an aquarium fish called Oriental weather loach, which is, interestingly enough, we catch it now in the Chicago River. I was working on it back in Australia. And that's when I decided, there's a lot to learn about it, with invasive species here.
Mm-hmm. And you don't want to continue, or you don't want to study that species here, though?
It makes crayfish look easy to study. It is it's an aquarium fish. A part of the reason that it's in the aquarium trade, I think, is because it's really hard to kill. But it's very, very difficult to trap. It's long and skinny. It looks a bit like an eel, although it's not an eel, but it looks a bit like an eel. So it is. We never see what goes on in the traps, but it is probably expert at getting out of our traps. The other thing that makes it difficult is it doesn't have a swim bladder. So one of the main ways that we can sample for fish is with electroshocking. And when you electroshock, the fish will float, and you get 1 or 2 seconds to try and scoop them up. This one sinks. So in a system like the Chicago River, it sinks, and you certainly can't see it.
Yeah. And how does it survive without the air bladder then to regulate its?
It's benthic, so it lives on the
Okay.
bottom. Yeah.
So no need.
No need. Yep. And it has this other fantastic, the amazing adaptation is that it's called a highly vascularized hind gut, is the physiological way that people talk about it. But basically it can breathe air, and it has so many blood vessels around its stomach that it can withdraw enough air from its stomach to keep its system going.
Oh, wow.
So it can live in really heavily polluted water because it will come up and take a breath. And in Australia, it's been found sort of in damp soil, usually under a log or something, in damp soil, on a dry river or lake bed.
Interesting.
And it found alive. Yeah. So it's a real survivor of a species.
Well, speaking of surprising things, what would you say is the most surprising thing that you've discovered with crayfish?
I've actually had a master's student who just defended their work, and they were looking at microplastics in crayfish in the North Shore channel of the Chicago River. And that has been just, I'm not an expert in this area. I've become something of an expert, but certainly my graduate student has taught me most of what I know, as they have learned it along the way. We've found the highest concentrations of microplastics in crayfish that have ever been found anywhere. One of the most surprising things we've found are these things that we're calling them fiber balls. Crayfish have a relatively large portion of their stomach, which then narrows into that long tube that runs down the underside of their tail. They're taking in so many microplastic fibers that it's actually forming these, like a hairball of microplastics in that large part of their stomach. So when we process them, which is, we catch the crayfish, we dissect out the stomach, and then we digest everything in peroxide. And what gets left behind is the plastic. The peroxide dissolves all of the organic material, the plastics are left behind. But we have these, they can be quite large, up to about 1 centimetre long, and maybe half a centimetre around. These really tight, clumped aggregations of plastic fibers that are inside these crayfish. Mm-hmm. And the crayfish, as far as we can tell, are healthy enough, right? They're still, we caught them in traps, and so that's one thing that's been surprising. The other thing that's been surprising, we've done quite a bit of work in the North Shore Channel looking at predation on crayfish. So the main predators out there are largemouth bass, and there's a really fantastically healthy population of largemouth bass in the channel. That was surprising to me when we started looking at that. There are the two invasive species, the red swamp and the rusty crayfish, that dominate the crayfish community in there. We find something else once every 500 traps or something that we set. Those fish, when we've been capturing them, and then we look at their stomach contents, and we do that via this process called lavage, which is you put a tube down their throat, and the fish is alive and they don't seem too disturbed by this. You put a tube down their throat, you pump their stomach full of water, and then they vomit, and we can capture what comes out. Even in areas where, well, so the fish have this very strong preference for the red swamp crayfish. And even in places where we can't catch red swamp crayfish, we can catch loads of rusty crayfish, but we can't catch red swamp crayfish with our technology. When we catch fish, they're full of them. So that's been, really interesting that that there's this interaction between this one species and the fish, but somehow the rusty crayfish are able to avoid predation.
And do we have a theory on as to why that is?
Yeah, my working theory is that red swamp crayfish are incredibly aggressive. So they're a bigger species than the rusty crayfish. They have bigger claws, and they are always, for want of a more biologically correct term, they're always angry. So when we're working with them in the field, we pull up a trap, and if there's a trap that has red swamp crayfish, then we have to be really careful, getting our hand in there and picking them up, because every red swamp crayfish in there is rearing up, and it wants to take a piece of you, and when they get you, they'll draw blood. They're nasty. They get on and they hang on, and the only way to get them to let go is just to patiently put them down and wait until they decide it's time. So they're very aggressive. In contrast, the rusty crayfish, they're great. They're terrified when I reach into a trap and try to pick them up, so they're much easier to deal with. So we've done a decent amount of work on this, and it really looks like the thing that makes the red swamp crayfish get eaten more often is that when a fish approaches them, and there are some very large largemouth bass out there, 16 and occasionally 18-inch long largemouth bass. They love to eat crayfish. So when they approach a red swamp crayfish, we think that the response of the red swamp crayfish is to rear up and say, okay, let's have at it. And for the largemouth bass, that's amazing, right? You eat the crayfish. Whereas the rusty crayfish, when we've done experiments sort of threatening them, they just want to get away and hide. So we think that what's going on is that the red swamp crayfish have this adaptation to being super aggressive, which probably serves them very well in interactions with organisms their own size or smaller, like rusty crayfish. It doesn't appear to serve them well when they interact with much larger organisms. And that is probably an evolutionary adaptation. Red swamp crayfish are mostly found in swampy, turbid, sort of brown water areas in the southern US. So in those areas, fish predation is just a much less, fish are visual predators, so you're just much less likely to be threatened, have a credible threat from a fish.
Mm-hmm. I was reading that crayfish are often referred to as ecosystem engineers. Can you talk about what that means?
Yeah, ecosystem engineers is a very, the initial description of that term was that an ecosystem engineer is a species that causes large changes within its ecosystem, and in particular changes that really affect the available habitat for other species. So they're an engineer in the sense that they change the habitat, and that in turn changes the opportunities for other species. So we see other species appearing. Of course, once a term like that comes out within a discipline, everybody wants to believe that their species is an ecosystem engineer. So I think it's a term that has lost a little bit of its punch over time. I certainly think that crayfish are ecosystem engineers, though. So, for example, red swamp crayfish are burrowers. So they burrow into the bank, and that increases the turbidity of the water. It weakens the bank somewhat, and it creates opportunities for anything else that wants to be able to use a hole. Other species of crayfish, for example, the rusty crayfish up north and also around here, it will clear cut the macrophytes, the aquatic plants. So one of the things that we've seen up there is you can go from these lakes that have, fantastic, dense, biodiverse macrophyte beds to just a sandy bottom. So that is, almost entirely detrimental for every other organism in the lake. But it fits that engineering, the ecosystem engineer idea, because it very drastically changes the habitat, and we see lots and lots of species disappear.
And do we know why the crayfish do that?
They are extremely messy eaters. So when they come into a lake, and again, this is work from northern Wisconsin, we can trace the disappearance of their food sources. So the snails disappear first, right? And to a crayfish, which are not, crayfish can move quickly backwards, but they're not particularly good hunters. They can't move that quickly forwards and grab things. So snails are great, right? They're a little packet of protein and fat, and if you can find it, then it's not going to disappear in a hurry, right? So the snails disappear, and then other slow-moving invertebrates disappear, and then the plants. The crayfish, because they're benthic, they live on the bottom, you get a lot of, they can eat, this much of a plant, but because they're eating the bottom of the plant, the rest of it just floats up and floats away.
What are some of the other invasive species that you study?
Yeah, so we work on invasive plants as well as all sorts of invertebrates. So certainly in the North Shore Channel, my lab has worked, very much on these crayfish. Outside of that system, with some exceptions, but we've tended to work on trying to understand how invasive species are getting into the Chicago region and how we can prevent them. Another master's student of mine just defended her work in early December. And she looked at, she went into the recreational boat harbors along Chicago's shore and basically tried to figure out every invasive species, except for fish, because they're already being done by management agencies, but tried to figure out every invasive species that is in these harbors. So that's plants and invertebrates. And she found a bunch of them, including one fairly significant new find, starry stonewort, which is an invasive macroalgae. For all the world, it looks like an aquatic plant, but it's actually a macroalgae. So that work was driven not so much by, we're interested in this one species. It was driven by, we're interested in the role that these harbors are playing as, what we're now calling hotspots for invasion in the Chicago region. So the harbors are, they're these pockets of habitat that are very, very different to everything else in Lake Michigan. If you go to a harbor, there's organic matter on the bottom, there's soft substrates, there's sheltered water, it's not getting beaten up by waves and all that all the time. So it's not surprising that we find, or that we can find, very different communities of organisms there. Those harbors are also really highly connected to other freshwater ecosystems. They're connected by boats moving around, and boats can have a little bit of a plant fragment on them when they move that can fall off and grow, or they might be carrying live bait, or they might have a live well with the fish, or they might have some sort of mollusk or something growing on their hull. So those boats sort of traveling around the Great Lakes. We know that they move a lot of invaders. The harbours also have, several of them have boat ramps, which means that you can get all of those, invaders introduced in all of those ways from, perhaps from lakes that are far away when somebody launches their boat. And there are also sites of lots of recreation and human contact. If somebody has a fish tank and they no longer want the organisms in that tank, then the harbours are if you're, thinking I need to be nice to these organisms, then the harbours are a very convenient place to go and deposit those organisms, something that you should never do. But we think it happens. And also people go fishing in harbours and they use live bait. So her work was very much looking at, what is the role of these harbours in the introduction, the establishment, and then potentially the spread of invasive species. We've also, for a long time, we've been working on an invertebrate that is in the Illinois River. It's a scud. We don't have a better common name for it than scud, but it's an amphipod. So it's in the same group of organisms as the roly-polies or the pill bugs that you find under logs in your garden. It is native to estuaries on the western and the eastern side of the Atlantic. So that's, up and down the Atlantic coast of North America, and the same for Europe. In its native range, barely anything is known about it. It's one of many, many dozens of very, very similar looking organisms. It doesn't get to high densities, it doesn't do anything particularly special, so barely anything is known about it. It was moved into the Gulf of Mexico, probably by some sort of ship movement. And then it was discovered, and nobody had expected this, but it was discovered a couple of 100 miles up the Mississippi River. And it's continued to spread. And there's lots of, and it's now in the Illinois River as far as Dresden Island Pool. So that's down a little beyond Joliet, if you're traveling from Chicago. We've been studying it because it's a big concern for reaching the Great Lakes. We don't want any more invaders in the Great Lakes. From where it is in the Illinois River, it's a fairly short trip through the Des Plaines, which connects to the Chicago River, and then into Lake Michigan. So we started working on that in 2015, when I was able to get some funding from the Department of Natural Resources. And nobody had looked at it for 10 years. And the last time that it had been found in the Dresden Island Pool. So I was trying to establish myself as an academic, and I thought, this is amazing. I'm the person who's going to discover a new invader in the Great Lakes, because nobody's looked for it. Up until 2005, it had been spreading really quickly. So I designed this survey work, which was basically on the assumption that it was going to be well past Dresden Island Pool. And we spent a summer, and I had some excellent undergraduates working with me and a graduate student. We spent a summer sampling for it all the way through the Chicago River, the Sanitary and Ship Canal, out into the harbors. And we found a grand total of three of them, and they were all from the Dresden Island Pool. So it had not moved in 10 years, and we calculated that it had been moving, we think, hundreds of miles a year up until then. It had not moved. And it still hasn't, is the punchline. We keep going back and looking at it. It still hasn't. There's been a really interesting story has come out of Corey Susky's work at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He's a fish physiologist who's a colleague and friend of mine, an excellent scientist. But the big head and the silver carp, which sort of are often referred to as the Asian carp, have done the same thing. They moved up to the Dresden Island Pool very quickly, and then they stopped. So despite we have the electric barriers to try and prevent them, but apart from a few pretty isolated individuals, the the population has stopped at the Dresden Island pool. So what Corey Susky did was he said, well, I wonder if there's a stress response here. So he looked at fish that were near the leading edge of the invasion, and he's looked at the stress level in those fish, the physiological stress level, which he can do by looking at proteins and things. And then he looked at them progressively further downstream. And what he showed is that as they get to the Dresden Island pool, their stress levels are getting higher and higher and higher. And it really looks as though there's something in the water there that's preventing them from moving further. We've sort of followed along and we've done similar work looking at stress levels, which is a whole different ballgame, but we can look at physiological stress levels in this scud, this little organism. And we found the same pattern. As you get closer and closer and closer to Dresden Island pool, they get more and more stressed. So what we think is going on, well, really, we're really quite sure what's going on. The Dresden Island pool is where all the water that drains Chicago, which is almost entirely treated sewage. Almost all of the water in the Chicago River, almost all the time, is treated sewage. At the Dresden Island pool, that's where it meets the Kankakee River. And the Kankakee River drains a mostly agricultural area. So we think what's happening is that the contribution of Chicago's sewage is putting pollutants into the water that these species, the silver and the bighead carp and the scud, can't deal with. So they can get as far as the Dresden Island pool, but they can't go further. So we've been doing some work that's been really interesting, trying to, I think that we've pretty much told that story now in a clear way, that there is a pollutant or some complex of pollutants. If you look at, it was the US Geological Survey did a study a few years ago where they tried to identify all of the things in the river that are not water. And it's a bewildering array of, anything that you can buy from Walgreens, either in front of or behind the pharmacist's desk, is in there, as well as its metabolites and things. Anything you can buy at Home Depot to put on your yard or to paint your house or something, there's at least trace amounts in the water. So it's this overwhelming array of pollutants that it could be. So we haven't yet started this work, but we've applied for some money with a collaborator who is an analytical chemist, Gordon Getzinger. He's actually 2 floors below. And we're going to try and figure out what these pollutants are. And it leads to this really interesting situation. The Chicago River has been cleaned up enormously over the last couple of decades, and we've seen these huge increases in the number of fish species that can live there as a result of just better water quality. So there's this possibility that as water quality conditions continue to improve, it might unleash a wave of invasions.
Mm-hmm. But wouldn't you have further south, instead of the urban pollutants, you'd have agricultural runoff?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So as you go further downstream, you do see more and more of that agricultural runoff. So one of the things that we can do is we can discount some of those pollutants. We can say, well, it's not, and I'm not coming up with the names of them at the moment, but if there are pollutants that are getting to much higher densities downstream where the fish are doing fine, then we can say, well, it's not those, and it's not those, and it's not those. That still leaves us with hundreds of pollutants.
Mm-hmm. What would be your response? Because I have heard the argument that we shouldn't be allocating so much time and resources into trying to prevent invasive species from encroaching in these other ecosystems and environments. What would be your response to someone that said it's a losing cause, just let it happen and we allocate our time and resources to other things?
Yeah, as a scientist who almost all of the money that gets spent on my research, paying my research associates and graduate students and buying equipment and whatever else we need. Almost all of that money comes from, through federal and or state channels. So I take seriously that I have a responsibility, if I'm going to spend that money, to be doing work that's going to inform real action by policymakers and managers, and I want to give them the type of information that they can best use to make the best decisions. So, I can talk much better about freshwater invasive species. Once they get into an area with a very, very small handful of exceptions, we can't control them, let alone eradicate them. There are very, very few examples from either freshwater or marine systems where we've been able to sort of substantially reduce impacts by reducing the density of the invader. The way that we might, in some cases, be able to eventually reduce impacts is just by adapting. There is an increasing body of work, and I've been involved in this, and it sort of comes from this very question that you posed. There's been an increasing number of ecologists and freshwater invasion biologists who've worked with economists to ask the questions of things like, how much is it worth spending on prevention? So what are the expected losses if this next species arrives? And what does that tell us about how much we might spend on prevention? And that's been really important work, I think. From the manager's point of view, they're also spending public money. And if they're trying to prevent an invader, then their sign of success is they spend money and nothing changes. And that's a bit more difficult, I think, to sell to the people who are paying the taxes than we spent money and here's how things changed. But that work that, I've worked a little bit with economists, and many other people in the field have worked with economists. It very, very consistently shows that if we put even just for the things that we can apply economic value to, if we put an economic value on them. So this is things like how much people pay to go fishing, for example. When we put an economic value on that, then the value of prevention looks like an absolute bargain. So that's one response, is just, even if you take a hard-nosed financial approach, prevention looks like an absolute bargain. There's also, there's a lot of work that gets done trying to slow down the spread of species. So that's things like having boat washing stations, which are not super expensive, but they're not super cheap. So you can have a boat washing station, for example, if you know that a certain lake has an invader and you don't want it to spread. You can set up a boat washing station with a pressure washer, and you can pay somebody to be there, and they can make sure that as people pull their boats out of the lake, they get washed, and that helps to prevent the spread. Realistically, we can't wash every single boat. We can't wash every single part of a boat. So more realistically, what we're doing is reducing the chances. We're reducing the probability for every boat that it will take the invasive species somewhere else. So essentially, we're slowing down the invasion. That also has huge value, right? If we think about, so perhaps, something like zebra mussel will eventually be invasive in all of the habitats in the US where it can survive. If we can put that off for 20 or 50 or 100 years, then that's enormously valuable, right? If we think about our own health, if I'm going to die someday, but if I can stay as healthy as possible for as long as possible, every year is enormously valuable. And in the way that we use freshwater ecosystems for recreation and in the ways that they can be very economically important. Just delaying the inevitable is very valuable. And it also, it then does offer the possibility that hopefully in the future we will have better technologies for controlling these species. So it offers the possibility that if we can slow it down, then we'll have less of a problem to deal with when these new technologies come along.
Can you talk a little bit, I was reading that you're collaborating with some scientists in India that directly impacts human welfare.
Yeah, that was a project that I did a little while ago. It's of all the projects that I've done, it's the one of which I'm extremely proud of that work. It was a lot of work. I was contacted by a graduate student in Kashmir. I learned a lot about the political and military and social situation in Kashmir through this collaboration. But he reached out to me about, because he'd seen the work that I'd been doing on the economics of controlling invasive species. There is a very large lake in Kashmir, Wooler Lake, which is extremely important to the people who live around it. They tend to be, I think there's 18 villages around the lake, and they're just enormously reliant upon fishing and on harvesting aquatic plants. It in itself is a fascinating lake. It receives its main pulse of water during the summer and early fall as the snow melts in the Himalayas around it. So the lake grows enormously, and then it shrinks again through winter when everything is ice, and so no water is coming down. So it has these amazing pulses. So just from an ecological point of view, it was a really interesting system to learn about. But it's been invaded by a couple of floating aquatic plants. And in the whole legion of freshwater invasive species, floating aquatic plants are some of the worst. They're some of the worst ecologically because they monopolize sunlight. They sit on the surface of the water. They capture all of that sunlight, which means that, of course, none of it gets down below them. So you don't have other plants, you don't have algae growing, and those are the bottom of the food chain. So when you get a serious invasion with floating aquatic plants, they are true ecosystem engineers. Things change very quickly. So he reached out to me and he said, can we do some economic modeling to look at how we should manage this species? And we looked for economic data, and it doesn't exist. But my response was, look, this is such a terrible invasion. The economics, to a certain extent, they don't matter. If we can show, and we could show that, people were leaving their villages, people were leaving their family to go and find work elsewhere because they could no longer catch enough fish, or they could no longer harvest the plants that they had to. And my response was, if we can show that, that's plenty to show that this is bad. So this collaboration lasted quite a while. He would go silent for months at a time whenever there was conflict in Kashmir, which was more often than we hear about in the US media, or at least the media that I'm looking at. So all cell phones and internet would be turned off for 6 months at a time, and I just had to, sit and wait. I had a very good undergraduate, and we were able to get some funding from the Pew Center for Crisis Reporting. We convinced them that this is a crisis. So she was able to travel there, and unfortunately I couldn't get money for me to go, but she was able to travel around Kashmir and gather a bunch of information. And we ended up collaborating on this paper, which is presumably where you learned about this. But it was a real example of, and I think that this happens far more than is reported on, but invasive species really impact communities that are sort of lower on the economic ladder. Living in a place like Chicago, we get our food from the grocery store, we work and get paid in industries. And invasive species can certainly be annoying, right? But they're not going to stop us from our next meal. They're not going to stop us from being able to harvest something that we need to be able to sell. If you're a subsistence farmer, or if your economic situation is such that you rely directly on something from a natural resource, an invasive species can mess everything up for you. And that's very much what we're seeing at Woollow Lake, which is that these invasive species came in, and yeah, as I mentioned, they're breaking up families and villages. People are leaving their village to go and find work elsewhere, and they're actually in many cases finding that very difficult, because the skills that you learn growing up to be a fisherman are very different to those that you need in a city. So so we and more broadly, I think about this as an issue for environmental justice. Invasive species, we have them because of globalization, right? It's because we have these fantastic ways now of moving people and goods around the world. And we know that a sort of a side effect of that is also moving non-native species, which can become invasive. So there are people who, the group of people who I think gain the most from globalization are the ones like us living in a place like Chicago, where we suffer the least from the problems of invasive species. The people who are not really involved in this whole globalized economy, at least in very many cases, they're people who are the most affected by invasive species. And so I really enjoyed that collaboration. It allowed me to sort of explore some of these topics that had been rattling around inside my head for a while. And it was just, somewhat devastating to learn what it's like to live and try to be a scientist in Kashmir. Incredibly, the challenges are just incredible, things that I've never had to deal with. So, somewhat devastating to learn about that, but also, really interesting to learn about the work that's being done there and the ecosystems.
So are they able to implement any mitigation efforts there?
So the things that, the thing that we recommended in that paper was, so floating aquatic plants are really damaging, but they're also relatively easy as aquatic plants go to control, because by their nature they're floating. You can pick them up. So our suggestion was, for a relatively small amount of money, you can pay these fishermen to go out and harvest these plants, and then you can take them to land and you can dispose of them in a way that that ensures they won't spread. So you're never going to completely eradicate the species. There's just they have seeds, and there's really no prospect of that at the moment. But we have this underemployed group of people who are very good at being on the water, who have boats, who with some financial encouragement could be out there clearing these plants. And if that was done consistently, then in turn, that would allow the ecosystem to function as it had previously. So you'd still have the invader, but as long as you're getting rid of a substantial amount of it every year, the fish populations would not suffer in anything like the way that they had. There's also the potential for biological control organisms. One of the difficulties of this area is that it gets really, really cold in winter, and there's quite a bit of testing that would need to be done. First of all, to figure out, the basics of biological control. Are there native species that the biocontrol organism might attack? But secondarily, can the biological control organism and I'm stretching my brain to remember, but I think it's a species of weevil. Can it survive winter? Because it gets really cold.
And could you talk a little bit about some of the barriers that you're working on here in the U.S. in barrier systems to prevent invasive species from proliferating?
Proliferating, yeah. Well, I mentioned, the water quality, which is really, we think, acting as a barrier. It's a diffuse barrier. It's not a barrier in the way that we normally think about it, but at least for silver and bighead carp, and for the scud, the amphipod that we work on, it seems to be a pretty hard and fast barrier preventing their spread. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, with funding from Congress and from the states, has established these electric barriers in the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. So this is where the Chicago River system has been extensively re-engineered so that it drains away from the lake, and it all funnels into the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal before it flows down to Dresden Island Pool and then the Illinois River. It was around 2009, 10, and 11 was the peak of concern about what was then called Asian carp, what we now call silver and bighead carp. The term Asian carp is biologically unhelpful. It refers to more than one species. Different people who use the term Asian carp are referring to different numbers of species, so it's just not that. It's easy, but it's not that helpful. So we now think about silver and bighead carp are the two species of greatest concern. It would be exceedingly difficult to put a physical barrier in the Sanitary and Ship Canal because it was 1900 when the river was reversed. Almost all of the plumbing in Chicago is predicated on the idea that the water flows west. It would be exceedingly difficult to change that. Billions and billions of dollars and decades of work. But we wanted to come up with, or the Army Corps of Engineers wanted to come up with an alternative. Fish, really, but not surprisingly, fish don't like being electrocuted. So the idea was to create these electric barriers, which had been used elsewhere in much smaller scale applications. To create these electric barriers that would be zones of the Sanitary and Ship Canal that the fish would not want to enter. So if you can create them, then fish that are coming from downstream and heading towards Lake Michigan are going to say, I am not going in there. And even if they're very enterprising and they get into the electric barrier, they're going to be stunned and the water is flowing, sort of pushing them backwards. So we have these electric barriers, and they exist and they're working now. And from all the reports, from most of what we know about them, they're probably quite effective. They do have some issues. One is that when you put a large piece of metal into any electric field, it distorts things. So when you have boats and barges going through, we're learning more and more about how that distorts the electric field. And potentially, if a fish is swimming close enough to a barge, it might not get so much of the electric field that it would be deterred from moving through. And certainly the wakes of some of these boats, even if a fish was stunned, it could be dragged through in the wake. As I said, I've worked mostly on invertebrates. There are plenty of invertebrates that we don't want to get into the Great Lakes as well. From the Illinois River. Well, I say plenty. There's a handful. There will be many more it's likely there will be many more in the future. So in my lab for quite a while, we've been working on, how does the electric barrier affect invertebrates, right? Because this is sort of the it's become sort of the barrier for invasive species. So we worked with a professor from the physics department here, Bo Pollack, who was great because he understands how electricity moves through water, which I at least didn't. I understand a little now. And we've been able to set up, it's a 4-foot long fish tank in the lab, and we can put whatever electric field we want through the water in that tank. So we can take invertebrates and we can expose them to the conditions that we think exist out there in the sanitary and ship canal. And we can do things like attach those invertebrates to a piece of metal to see if that makes a difference to how they respond, and so on. So we've been doing a bunch of work on a bunch of different species. And we found that invertebrates are much, much less affected than fish. That's not a particularly surprising result because the electricity affects the nervous system, and invertebrates, by definition, have a much less well-developed nervous system. So it's not a completely surprising result, but one thing that we have found surprising is that many of these invertebrates are not affected at all. You can turn on the electric barrier to the point where, we're all standing around in linesman gloves and making sure that we're standing on rubber mats, and we have protocols to make sure that, that none of us are going to accidentally stick our hands in there. And these invertebrates are just swimming around. Yeah, so, I think that that's been really important work, and it's work that I've spent a lot of time talking to the Army Corps of Engineers and other agencies about, trying to emphasize the electric barriers are great, right? But they're also limited. There are lots more invasive species that could be very harmful in the Great Lakes if they get through. So we ought to be also thinking about them.
Do you have a particular story from the field that you'd like to share that either was a failure or success that really taught you something?
Yeah, while I was a graduate student, so I was doing my PhD. My PhD was a very interesting story. It changed very much the way that I think about science. I came into it as an ecologist. I was interested in figuring out ecology in freshwater systems, figuring out how does this species affect this species, and how does temperature and oxygen levels interact. So I believed, that my career would be spent doing that sort of not quite pure ecology, because I work on the applied issue of invasive species, but that I'd be really, down in the weeds of ecology. And I came into the lab at Notre Dame, and the project that I first started working on was looking, and I was very leery about this. I was a little, when my advisor suggested it, I was thinking, no, that's not what ecologists do. But we were going out to pet stores and bait stores and live food markets and looking at the species, the freshwater species that were being sold in those places. And what we were interested in was whether they're likely to become invasive. And this was working, that was funded by the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. And almost immediately when I started working on that, somebody who's now a very good friend and collaborator, Pat Charleboy, started sending me emails and calling me and saying, so what are you learning that can be used for management, and how can we incorporate this into our outreach? And at first I was probably a jerk, but I remember thinking, no, that's not what I do. I do ecology, right? I don't do that. By the end of my PhD, and again, this would have horrified me if someone had told me this before I began my PhD. I was working with economists, coming up with economic models to try and describe the invasion process and how things work. And I think by far my most influential work, to date, came from that work with economists. And it was great fun, right? At first. And as I say, I would have been horrified if someone had told me, before I left Australia, you're going to have whole chapters of your PhD thesis that will be about economics. I would have laughed them off. But I really enjoyed the challenge of learning enough about their discipline that I could have intelligent conversations with them. And that took years to get to that point with economists. It's a very different set of assumptions about how the world works. So that was something that that really surprised me. It's something that I continue to work on, and it keeps informing the work that I do. And it is something that that experience, learning how much fun it is to learn about another person's discipline, and also the value of interdisciplinary work to actually inform real solutions. That's something that I keep doing. I've worked with social scientists to try and figure out what is the relationship between knowledge and behavior for boaters. So how much does a boater know about invasive species, and what do they actually do to try to prevent the spread of them? And are those two things linked? If we just go out and give people more knowledge, does that mean they'll behave better? And the answer is no, unfortunately. It seems like people are creatures of habit. We can give them more knowledge, but they know what they like to do with their fishing pole at the end of a day. And if they were brought up to wash it off and dry it for a week before they use it again, that's what they'll do. If they were brought up to leave it sitting in their wet boat where it can remain infested by invasive species, then that's what they'll do. So through my PhD, I sort of went away from what I thought I was going to be doing. There was one summer when I did set myself up to do a much more straightforward piece of ecology. I was looking at the effect of rusty crayfish on lakes in northern Wisconsin, and there was sort of some fairly new theory, or not really theory, but an explanation, I guess theory, of multiple stable states that had made its way into ecology. And I wanted to test whether rusty crayfish were pushing these lakes into a different state by eliminating all of the aquatic plants, pushing them into a different state from which those lakes could then never recover. So I spent a whole summer going lake to lake. We visited, I think we had 30 lakes that were in our list. We visited every one, I think, 4 times. And we were taking sediment samples and taking plant samples and doing all the right things. I then spent probably a year back at Notre Dame analyzing all the data, which was long evenings with the carbon nitrogen analyzer, feeding in tiny little pellets of dried sediment and getting the results. And the outcome from that was I didn't collect the right data. I produced enormous Excel spreadsheets full of data, and I just kind of miscalculated. So my PhD, in some senses, was a story of, when I tried to do what I thought I was going to do for my PhD, it didn't work. And that was fine, right? I had, 5 years so I could make up for that. But instead, I got really interested in things that I never thought I'd be interested in. And it's, being interested in those other things that's sort of driven my work since.
But we probably could use more biologists looking at the economics of biodiversity or invasive species too, right?
Yeah.
Because that would help when you go to policymakers maybe changing policies.
Yeah. Yeah, so the thing that drew me to that initially was I started doing some work on what we call risk assessment for invasive species. So that's where, and there are lots and lots of ways that you can do it, but we try to make a prediction of what might become invasive in the future. So for example, I I just explained that work where we were going out to pet stores and live food markets and bait shops, and we were ordering from all sorts of places online. And so we were getting a lot of information about potential invaders, right? Species that were being introduced to the Great Lakes region. So then I started getting involved in risk assessment, which is looking sort of species by species and making predictions of the types of impacts that they'd have. I was naive. I took my information off to managers and policymakers, and I said, look, here are the species that you should ban from sale, and you should make sure that there are strong fines for people who sell these. And the response was, well, what's that going to cost, right? The fact that these species are in commerce means that they have benefits, right? And those benefits are really they're relatively easy to quantify, right? You can go to a pet store and they can tell you, well, I sold 300 of these last month and I sell them for $5 each, so it's worth $1,500 a month to me. I go along and say, well, my best prediction is that if this is released and if it spreads, it's going to cause these types of impacts. But it's very, very difficult to put an economic or to put a financial, a dollar value on those impacts. So it makes it very difficult to talk to a policymaker, particularly in states where they have to show, a financial cost-benefit analysis to do things. It makes it very difficult to convince them that, we ought to pull these species out of trade so that we can, avoid what might happen in the future. And that's really what led me to working with economists. I sort of threw my hands up in the air at this point, but then my advisor said, well, you should talk to some economists and see if they can help. And I talked to some economists and they said, yeah, we can help you to figure that out. So I did, a series of projects and published a series of papers showing that and this was true for just about everything that we looked at, the value of additional species in trade is actually very, very low. And the way I normally explain that, if you walk into a pet store, and it's a relatively well-stocked pet store, a PetSmart or something, and you've got $100 in your pocket to spend on fish, you're probably not going to walk out of there without spending $100 because you couldn't find the one you wanted, right? There are so many species there that the market is kind of saturated. So adding one more species doesn't really help the store, and subtracting one species doesn't really help. It doesn't really impact the store that much. So I worked with a very good economist and these are all, modeling or methods for modeling economic data and gathering economic data that, I got to the point where I could have intelligent conversations about it, but it was good that I was working with economists. So this economist, Mike Springborn, who I worked with, he's now at UC Davis, was able to, look at this. So, what is the true value of adding another species to the trade? What's the true value of subtracting species from the trade? How does that change depending on how many species are in trade? And then we could look at the impacts. And even when we can only apply sort of financial values to a really small subset of the impacts, right? Perhaps it's, we know that this is going to reduce bass populations by 40%, so that means that there'll be less spending and things like that. Even when we can only apply a financial value to a really small subset of the impacts, prevention always looks like a great strategy. Yeah.
A great deal too, right?
Yes, a fantastic deal. It's an absolute bargain. So that's, and that's driven a lot of the work that I've done since. And I like to think that has been influential work for managers and policymakers. So, it's not, hopefully I've certainly convinced some of them that it is worth listening to people like me when we come along and say, here are 3 species that are in trade that we think probably shouldn't be in trade. here's why. They listen to me, they'll have a conversation with me now, whereas, previously the response would be, well yeah, but what's that going to cost?
Right. And that's improvement, right?
That's improvement, yeah.
What do you miss most about Australia?
People ask me that a lot. I miss, friends, of course. There are people that I miss. I miss the landscape. That's a landscape that I grew up in, hiking and scuba diving, and just being in a landscape. It becomes a part of a person. So I miss that. I miss that, and this is particularly true in academia, I've discovered. There are a lot of academics in North America who define themselves very much by their academic work. Almost to the point where talking about a hobby would be an admission that you don't love your work quite enough. That is not the case in Australia. People are people first, and then they have a job on top of that. So I miss that. But I don't, lie awake at night, thinking about this hellish existence that I have here. I came to the US, and I have enjoyed my time here immensely. I've had great opportunities here for my work. I now live in Evanston, and I honestly can't think of, there's no neighborhood in Australia that I would prefer to live in. I've married an American, and we have 2 kids, and that's all going great. So, I really enjoy my life here. And being, this would be the same in Australia, but being an academic is, I love it. I get to interact with undergraduates, and that's not without its frustrations, but by their very nature, the students that I interact with are at an exciting time of life, right? They've got these huge possibilities open to them. So they're a really, interesting group of people to work with. They're excited about what comes next. And it's a real privilege to get to work with them and to, help them to think about what might come next for them. I enjoy that part of it. I've been lucky that I've been able to fairly consistently have good funding for my research. And to a fairly large extent, I've been able to study things that really interest me. I've been able to find money to study things that really interest me. And that's kind of an enormous privilege. It's pretty amazing. I get to, surround myself with people in my lab. I surround myself with people who are interested in the same things, and we work together and we try and figure out these things. So my life here is pretty great. There are certainly things about Australia that I miss. But to be honest, if somebody came along and offered me a similar job to what I have here back in Australia, then at least at the moment I'd stay here.
Has there been a book, specifically a work of fiction that has really impacted your life?
Recently, I love Barbara Kingsolver books. She's an excellent ecologist who happens to also be an excellent fiction writer. I think that the work of fiction that, at least at the moment, has been most influential in my life, or that I've most enjoyed, has been her book Demon Copperhead, which I think is still her most recent. It's a remarkable book. I've also read, this was another one that I recently finished, Playground by Richard Powers. So he's the guy who wrote Overstory, which was another great book about forests and trees. he's just finished up a recent book, or sorry, I just finished a more recent book by him, which was really interesting. It was actually large parts of it are set in Evanston. I didn't know that when I opened the book, but it started talking about the streets that I drive down and run down every day. Parts of it are set on the south side of Chicago and at St. Ignatius College Prep, which I visited recently as part of the Jesuit thing between Loyola. So that was a great book too. The other one that really helped me to understand more about the ecological history of the US was Bark Skins by Annie Proulx. It's a brick of a book. It's an intimidating book to look at. But it was this amazing sort of history of the exploitation of North American forests. Told, in fiction through the stories of these sort of intersecting characters over generations. But just that got me interested in the non-fiction history, and I went and read some of that and realized that wow, Annie Proulx really she got it right. So those are some works of fiction that have been influential.
Yeah. And how would you say that your studies, your work, looking at invasive species, crayfish, how would you say that has impacted your own humanity?
That's something that I that I think about, and at one level, as I said, I'm very privileged. I get to think about what's going on in the bottom of a river that runs through an urban area. That piece of it, that pure ecology, probably doesn't have a huge impact on my humanity. One of the things that we do in the lab and that we work very hard on is keeping up with the literature. Well, we kill a whole lot of crayfish every year. They're invasive, we get funding to pull them out. We've done quite a bit of work to figure out how we can kill them in the most humane way possible. So that's sort of an ongoing project in the lab that we talk about. I think the biggest way that this has affected my humanity, over the arc of my career as a professor, I began at Loyola in 2011. And I was anxious and I was motivated to prove myself. I wanted to, getting an academic position it's a difficult thing in my life. I've been offered exactly one of them at a university and I'm still here. So I came in and I was anxious to prove that I could write the types of funding proposals that would bring in money, that I could attract the types of students who could do really good work and publish great papers, that I could publish papers myself. And also, I was anxious to prove that I could teach classes that got reviews from students that were at least as strong as the classes that my colleagues were teaching. And, by and large, I did that, right? I got tenure. And after tenure, the pressure comes off a little bit. And then I got full professor, which is that second and final promotion on the sort of professorial track. I got that a few years ago and the pressure came off a bit more. I now see my role in the lab as instead of my role as being a sort of a factory manager for a factory that produces science, I see it as I manage a lab that I desperately hope produces happy, well-rounded students when they leave. So I spend, and I do this consciously and I think subconsciously as well, I spend far more time now than I ever did before talking to students about what else is going on in their lives. And, you know, particularly about what they plan to do for summer opportunities where they can, you know, where they might be able to do an internship or something. And certainly, you know, what they'll do when they finish here at Loyola. So I think that that's the way that it's sort of affected my humanity. Instead of seeing the ecology, the funding, the papers that I produce, instead of seeing those as the end point, I see those much more as a means to an end, right? By working with my students and helping my students to become proficient at all of this, I can then help my students to have the skills, the knowledge, the mindset, and frankly the confidence to sort of move forward and you know, to do great things with their lives. Yeah, so that's the sort of roundabout answer to that question.
Yeah.
How does my work affect my humanity? You know, that's something that's evolved over time. It's still evolving. But yeah, my attitude towards the work that I do now is much less focused on the metrics of how many papers did I publish last year, how many dollars did I bring in last year, and much more focused on, you know, who are these humans who are working with me in the lab and how can I help them.
Mm-hmm. And what is one thing that gives you hope for the future?
You know, particularly in environmental science, we're going through a bit of a dark patch. But I see the students who I have in the classroom with my teaching, the students I have in the lab who are doing research with me, and they are smart, motivated, very knowledgeable people. And you know, I think that this moment that we're going through at the present time is, you know, I'm hopeful that it will pass, and that we'll get to see, you know, these students who are, you know, perhaps one of the first generations who, I mean, we might refer to them as you know, being something like climate change natives, right? They're people who have for the length of time that they've been sort of aware of what's going on in science and in news cycles and in policy, climate change has been a big issue. So I think that, you know, they're really primed to you know, to be unleashed on the world and to hopefully you know, have some very positive impacts. So that gives me hope.
Yeah, that's a good place to end, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, Ruben, I appreciate the time.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun to talk.